Namaste everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of the Vichaar Manthan podcast. And in particular, we're calling this one Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives podcast. Very excited to introduce to you all Dr. Oranji Taylor. He is a fellow at Vichaar Manthan and will be chairing one of our fireside conversations within the Civics vertical at this year's Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives conference. Namaste, Oranji. Welcome to the podcast.
Namaste, Sumichi. Really great to be here. My first time here on the podcast, so yeah, really happy.
I'm sure we'll have you back for a later conversation with something more nuanced and specific.
Let's see how today goes.
For sure. And in particular, though, today we are talking about the Sustainable Narratives Conference. So I just want to get your quick take on why Vichaar Manthan is having a conference that's called Sustainable Narratives. Why is something like that needed at a time of the world today?
Well, I think one of the big things that we need to think about is that we live in such a rapid society. And in this society, we get so caught up in the most recent big issue that's happening. And rarely do we take stock on where we're headed in 50 years, where we're headed in 100 years, where we're headed in 200 years, 500 years, and which ideas are going to take us there. And it's something that I think our ancestors were actually very good at, and hence the reason why we're here 200 years, 500 years later, and still kicking and thriving. So I think this conference gives us an opportunity to think at that level, and that's why I think it's really important.
It's a great point you raised there. I don't know if people are ready to think about the world beyond their lifetime. Sounds like great responsibility to have. And so in particular then, you're hosting a fireside conversation within the civics vertical. So why is something like civics important to society? Why is something like civics something we should consider for the next 100, 200, etc. years?
Well, I think the word civics and the word society they go together. They work hand in hand. For a society to function, you need to be civil, right? You need to be able to exist for a free society, I should say, to function. You need to be able to exist in that society and live amongst other people. And in today's society, you need to be able to live amongst other people who don't necessarily share the same views that you do. And this is the privilege that we have of a free society, and therefore civics is that subject which pertains to the rights and the duties that we have as citizens of a nation, and that enable us to live in a society together freely, and that those two work hand in hand. So and it's something that I don't think we talk about enough.
I have to agree. And you've pushed on a few words there, in particular freedom and things like liberty. So we've been discussing those things on the Vichaar Manthan podcast as of late. So for anyone that's tuning in and listening to the conversation today, thinking actually that's something I'm rather interested in, or that's something that's quite important to the world, then do go have a look at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all streaming platforms for those riveting conversations we have had already leading up to the event, and I think will be during the Sustainable Narratives Conference at the same time. And for anyone that hasn't registered yet, you can go to vichaarmanthan.org, have a look at Sustainable Narratives, have a look at those 7 verticals at the moment. But today we're talking about civics, and in particular with Dr. Oranji Taylor, we are going to be talking about the fireside conversation. And the title of that is, Can we reimagine education and its purpose? I think this is a great conversation. Education is ever important, but let's hear from Dr. Oranji, who will be chairing that fireside conversation at Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives Conference this year, 2022. So, Oranji, can we reimagine education? Can we think about its purpose? Why is something like this so important?
I think we need to do a little bit of a history lesson. No, I think we need to do 2 types of history lesson. One, we need to do one of what Vichaar Manthan has done, or what it's explored pertaining to education in the past. So let's just look at the last few years as opposed to looking back at the 10-year history of Vichaar Manthan, because I wasn't around for those years. So I'm just gonna and so I guess last year we did one fireside conversation which explored the idea whether schools are responsible for building character. And I think it was with Madhvi Haria that came onto the platform, a school teacher, and she she gave a very nuanced picture as to, well, schools don't necessarily currently deliver any form of education pertaining to character. But I think at the end of that, we still weren't fully clear as to whether schools should be responsible for this, or whether parents maybe should be responsible for this, or whether this is happening in society or not. And this is actually really interesting, because some of this conversation will spill over into the main civics panel, which is actually on the family unit. And I'm sure that you're going to have a similar conversation about that too, and I know that education will be quite central to that discussion as well. But this discussion will focus on the purpose of education, as opposed to the methods, and there we've actually explored this a little bit more in our book clubs. So I think Sumichi, I think you were there in our Oxford book club, where we read Krishnamurti's Beginnings of Learning. And Krishnamurti is a really fascinating character, and the book itself is very this dialogue format where he's talking to his students, and he's engaging in this very, very high level dialogue for young people to engage with, asking very profound questions like, what is responsibility? What is home? You know, these and very, very at a very, very philosophical level. And what I feel is that Krishnamurti's view is that education is supposed to be a liberating experience for young people. You know, with knowledge or the tools to learn, one can thrive in a free society. While others might say that education is there so that we might remain civil in a free society. And those are two very different views. So we had some really interesting conversations in our book club over many, many weeks, and we actually then and Krishnamurti was responsible for starting this school. Sumichi, you might remember the name of the school.
Brockwood Park.
Brockwood Park, that's the one. Yes, and it's a school in the UK, and they teach based on Krishnamurti's philosophy, and what was really interesting is we called one of the teachers from the school into our book club.
Excellent.
And we were really, really fascinated by the conversation that we had with the teacher, because we thought, oh, well, where are these kids now? You know, who have been under this education system for many, many years, and we found that most of them are doing very vocational subjects, and perhaps the subjects that we're probably the vast majority of society wouldn't say are what students are aiming for in today. It's not the STEM subjects, or not those. We're not creating prime ministers. You know, these kids are not going to Oxbridge, but they are good people.
But I think it depends. You know, in society, what do we need? Do we need what do we need people to be doing, or for the kids to be learning? And then there's the individual level of a wholesome education and the purpose behind that.
And that brings us to this the crux of this discussion, I think, and what should be that purpose of education. And let's go back to the other type of history lesson. Let's go to what was the historical reasoning for education. So if we go back to the Victorian era, and when I'm talking about education, I'm talking about, and I know another one of our Vichaar Manthan discussions that happened with the in collaboration with NHSF,
right.
explored the gurukuls versus
the Gurukul system.
grammar schools, and two very, very different systems, the ancient systems of education versus modern systems of education. And therefore, I want to clarify here that I'm talking about our modern public school systems, as opposed to some of these ancient forms of education. And in those modern school systems, I think the main purpose, this was created in the industrial era, and that we needed a workforce to be able to populate these industries, and therefore they needed these very basic skills of arithmetic and being able to read and write, to be able to for those industries to function, and therefore for society to function. And it was a very economic purpose for education. And yeah, go on.
So I think you're poking at lots of different parts of what this fireside conversation can bring up. Could I ask maybe what would be your most prevalent question for the fireside discussion? What is it what's the one thing that Dr. Oranji might want to get out of this?
I would like to see a very practical answer to this question. In terms of, okay, no, actually, let's revise that a little bit. I would like the question to be framed in terms of, what do we want society to look like?
Okay.
And can we build a purpose for education based on what that society is, or what that society should be?
Sure.
And that's what I'd love for our speaker to bring out in the discussion. And maybe we should talk a little bit about our speaker.
Yeah, for sure. So who is it that you will be hosting on this fireside conversation?
So our speaker, although we'll be hosting Sugata Mitra, and he's a computer scientist. And what he is most famous for, I should say, is that he conducted these what they call hole-in-the-wall experiments.
Okay.
Where essentially what he did was he left a PC in a room, a computer in a room in some of the most rural villages of India, and he let those children
figure it out.
Just figure it out.
Okay, sounds very interesting.
He just left it in the room and said, "Oh, I'm just leaving this here." He turned it on, obviously, and he just, that's it.
I wonder,
he just left.
Would they go onto Fortnite? Would they go to YouTube?
Well, let's remember this was back in the early 2000s.
Sure. Okay,
so these were very, very basic PCs. India was a very, very different place 20 years ago. And so those rural parts of India really hadn't seen any piece of technology. Mobile phones, I think, was it 2008 was the iPhone?
Sure.
So
yeah.
Mobile phone technology really hadn't penetrated the world at that point either. So so these kids really hadn't seen any piece of technology in their lives, and now they were given a computer, and the results that he found from these experiments was that actually, if you empower children to be able to teach themselves, then actually they can. And what he was finding was that there's a really wonderful TED talk that I encourage all of our listeners to go and watch as a really nice primer towards this fireside discussion. And he describes this whole story, and I feel like I would ruin it a bit if I go and tell his story myself. But he had some really interesting results, and I think it's worth viewing. But what I think is really important is that he focused more in his work so far on the method by which children should be educated. Sure. And I think Krishnamurti was similar. And where I want this conversation to go is, what should the purpose of education be? Should it be to educate the next workforce? Should it be to build good people? And then on top of that, whose responsibility should that be? Should it be the state's responsibility? Should it be the responsibility of the public school system? Or should parents be taking a greater hand a greater role in the education of their children.
And
So
I think some people might even say it's actually up to the children to do so.
Yeah, so some people would say, so actually this is the terminology that's applied to Sugata Mitra's method of education is actually the minimally invasive education. So this is what the term, which basically means that, hey, let them basically decide for themselves. But then I would argue, well, actually, if I put a bunch of like 9-year-olds in a room together in the UK, and whether they would actually then go towards whether they, but at the end of it would be competent in life, I don't know. I would question that.
I think that's questionable for sure. So lots of great themes and tags to pull on here, lots of different threads to thinking about education, especially here in the UK. I think, a lot of our national curriculum is based around passing an exam. If you look at GCSE rates and the way A levels are conducted these days, I can remember my schooling days. I don't think I felt like it was a wholesome experience gearing me up for life. Now, there are arguments about sort of going through college, and if you're going to university or higher education, you're more equipped to deal with that. But we can see the state of the world now, where you have things like quiet quitting and employers looking for people with experience. Yet people who are highly educated don't have that. Are they not rounded characters? And I think you've asked a few questions here today around, are they built for the economy? Are they built to be of good character? Can we see correlation in things like crime rates and education? I don't know. These are all great things to ask and great conversations to have here on Vichaar Manthan, and especially at the Sustainable Narratives conference coming up shortly on the 15th of September, actually, for anyone that hasn't signed up. And so actually the conference is on an exclusive platform. You won't catch it on YouTube. You'll have to sign up on AirMeet. So you must go to vichaarmanthan.org and register. There are some virtual conversations. There is a physical event taking place in central London. So I encourage everyone to sign up to that. Oranji, any parting thoughts or questions you think our audience should be having before we leave you here today?
I think I'd love for our audience to come with an open mind to this conversation and to the rest of the conference. I think this is also, I guess we can consider this as part of our education, and perhaps we can start to think, oh well, can we be part of that discussion, or can we be part of that solution by being part of this conference, by taking in some new knowledge, some new ideas that we wouldn't have perhaps engaged with before. And
maybe out of this we can actually derive some conclusions. I don't know.
I don't think we're going to derive any conclusions. I think this is to start conversations. This is for us to change these ideas and make them better. And I think that we need the audience to be participatory in all of that to make that happen. And
absolutely. And I think Vichaar Manthan has done that a lot, right? We're trying to start conversations about ideas that matter. And so even if you just take Vichaar and Manthan, it's the ideas and the churning of those and bringing great minds together, be it on this side of the camera, that side of the camera. Our listeners and the followership and the viewership are ever prevalent in that. Society is all of our responsibility. We've all hopefully been through some type of education system. Has it given us purpose? Has it solved the problems of the need? And will it be sustainable? Is our education a sustainable system? Here in the UK, globally, where are we at with all of that? So I think those are the types of questions that need to be asked, hopefully will be asked. And if you tune into Sustainable Narratives, I think we'll have a great conversation, especially in this fireside conversation here with Dr. Oranji Taylor and Sugata Mitra on can we reimagine education and its purpose. So thank you, Oranji. Thank you for that conversation. Thank you for introducing us to the civics vertical here at the Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives Conference. And I look forward to hearing you and the conversation that we have at the fireside. And for all our listeners at home, please do tune in. You need to register online. It is an exclusive event. and we'll be talking about ideas that matter and ideas that we should be investing in. If you need any further information, vichaarmanthan.org, look up Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives, and I hope to see you very shortly. Thank you and namaste.